I used to believe that some things in life were unshakable. The kind of truths you never question because questioning them feels unnatural. For me, that truth was my child. Hi. This me John D. Grace. For 12 years, I lived inside a reality where his laughter defined my mornings, and his quiet breathing at night reassured me that everything in my life still made sense. I never imagined that one test, one envelope, would later erase that certainty and replace it with a silence so loud it would follow me everywhere. I remember the day he was born with unnatural clarity, as if my mind refuses to let it blur. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion, and the fluorescent lights made everything look harsher than it really was. When the nurse placed him in my arms, he stopped crying almost immediately. People say newborns don't recognize faces, but in that moment, I felt chosen. His tiny fingers wrapped around mine with a strength that surprised me, and something inside my chest locked into place. I didn't become a parent that day. I became responsible for a life that would now define my own. The early years were not poetic or soft. They were loud, sleepless, and filled with mistakes I pretended not to notice. I learned how to warm bottles at 3 in the morning, and how to lie about being tired at work. I learned how to pretend I understood parenting while secretly Googling everything from fevers to tantrums. When he took his first steps, he didn't walk toward his mother or the toys scattered across the floor. He walked toward me. I still remember the way he fell halfway, laughed at himself, and tried again. That stubbornness became his signature. I used to say he got it from me. As he grew older, people began pointing out the similarities. The way he tilted his head when he was confused. The exact crease between his eyebrows when he concentrated. Even the same awkward pause before speaking in public. I accepted those observations without hesitation. Biology, after all, was obvious when you lived it every day. I helped him with school projects, attended parent-teacher meetings, and sat through school plays where he scanned the audience until his eyes found mine. Every time they did, he smiled a little wider, as if confirming I was still there. Our house was never perfect, but it was stable. We had routines that felt sacred. Saturday mornings were for cartoons and burnt toast. Sunday evenings were for homework battles that always ended in compromise. When he was scared of the dark, I sat beside his bed until sleep won. When he had nightmares, he came to me first. Not because I was stronger than anyone else, but because, in his world, I was safety. I watched him become his own person slowly, almost without realizing it. His voice deepened. His questions grew sharper. He started to challenge me, to disagree, to test boundaries. And every time he did, I felt an odd sense of pride. This was what raising a child was supposed to look like. Messy, emotional, exhausting, and meaningful. I believed I was watching my life continue through him. The idea that he might not be mine never crossed my mind. Not once. There were no suspicions, no dramatic hints, no hidden doubts whispering in the background. If anything, I felt secure in my role. I had been there for every fever, every scraped knee, every quiet drive home after a bad day at school. Blood felt irrelevant compared to time, effort, and love. Parenthood, I believed, was built, not assigned. The conversation that would later dismantle everything began as something ordinary. A doctor's appointment. A routine concern. A suggestion made casually, without weight. At the time, it felt like paperwork. Like another task on a long list of responsibilities I had mastered over the years. I agreed without hesitation, unaware that I was stepping toward a truth that had been waiting patiently for over a decade. That night, I watched my child sleep, the same way I had when he was an infant. His face looked peaceful, untouched by the complexity of the world. I remember thinking how strange it was that something so small could become the center of an entire life. I didn't know that this moment, this quiet, ordinary moment, would soon divide my life into two parts, everything before the test and everything after it. And in that moment, before the truth had a name, I was still a father who believed his world was intact. The test was never supposed to matter. That is what I kept telling myself in the days that followed. It was framed as a precaution, a routine confirmation for a minor medical concern. Nothing urgent. Nothing alarming. I signed the forms without reading them carefully, the way you do when life has taught you that hospitals are just places where answers eventually come and leave everything mostly unchanged. Weeks passed. Life continued with its familiar rhythm. School mornings, unfinished meals, half-listened conversations. I helped with homework while mentally planning the next day. I argued about screen time and bedtimes. There was nothing fragile about our routine. If anything, it felt permanent. That was the dangerous part. When you believe something is permanent, you stop protecting it. The call came on an afternoon that refused to stand out. I was at work, surrounded by noise, deadlines, and small problems that suddenly felt irrelevant. The voice on the other end of the line was professional and calm. Too calm. They asked me to come in to discuss the results in person. No details. No reassurance. Just a scheduled time and a polite tone that suggested this was not a conversation meant for public spaces. I told myself they always do this. Hospitals prefer face-to-face conversations. I repeated it like a mantra while driving there, my hands steady on the steering wheel, my thoughts carefully avoiding darker interpretations. Still, something inside me had already started to brace itself. Not panic. Anticipation. The kind that arrives before bad news, quietly rearranging your breathing without permission. The doctor didn't waste time. There were no comforting introductions, no unnecessary explanations. Just a file placed on the desk and a sentence that landed without drama, but with irreversible weight. The results were inconsistent with what was expected. At first, I didn't understand what that meant. I nodded, pretending comprehension while my mind scrambled to translate medical language into reality. Then the words became clearer. Biological markers. Probability. Exclusion. I felt detached, as if the conversation was happening to someone else. It took an uncomfortable amount of time before the meaning reached me fully. The test indicated that I was not the biological father. I remember staring at the paper, as if it might correct itself under pressure. Numbers and percentages stared back at me, indifferent and absolute. There was no room for interpretation, no margin for hope. Science does not negotiate. It concludes. My first reaction was not grief. It was rejection. A clean, instinctive refusal to accept what I was being told. I asked about errors, about sample contamination, about statistical anomalies. The doctor answered calmly, clearly accustomed to this reaction. The test had been repeated. The result remained unchanged. There was no mistake. I walked out of the hospital holding that folder like it contained something alive. Something capable of escaping if I loosened my grip. Outside, the world continued uninterrupted. Cars passed. People laughed. Someone complained on a phone call nearby. I remember thinking how cruel it was that nothing else had stopped when my entire understanding of myself had just collapsed. On the drive home, my thoughts turned violent, not toward anyone else, but toward memory. I replayed moments obsessively, searching for signs that had never existed. Faces, dates, conversations. I interrogated the past with a desperation that achieved nothing. Every memory I touched felt contaminated now, as if the truth had reached backward and altered them retroactively. When I reached home, my child was sitting at the table, focused on something trivial. He looked up and smiled when he saw me. The same smile I had seen thousands of times. My chest tightened in a way I had never experienced before. For the first time, I saw him through two lenses at once. The child I had raised and the stranger biology insisted he was. I said nothing. I couldn't. Words felt dangerous. I was afraid that if I spoke, something irreversible would spill out. Instead, I watched him talk about his day, unaware that the foundation of his life was quietly cracking beneath us. That night, after everyone was asleep, I sat alone with the test results spread out in front of me. I read them again and again, hoping repetition would dull their impact. It didn't. Each time, the same sentence echoed in my head, growing louder with every attempt to ignore it. If he wasn't mine, then whose was he? And more terrifying than that question was another one I wasn't ready to ask yet. If the truth came out, what would happen to the only relationship that had ever defined me? After that day, life did not explode the way stories often promise it will. It didn't shatter in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it fractured slowly, silently, in ways only I could feel. On the outside, everything looked the same. On the inside, I was carrying a truth that had no place to go. I didn't tell anyone. Not his mother. Not my family. Not even myself fully. I moved through the days as if I were performing a role I had already mastered. I woke him for school. I packed his lunch. I asked about his classes and listened carefully, afraid that any change in my tone might reveal what I now knew. He noticed nothing. Children are remarkably perceptive, but they trust their parents enough to overlook what adults try desperately to hide. The hardest part was the mirror. Every time I looked at him, my mind betrayed me. I began noticing differences I had never seen before. The shape of his nose. The way his smile leaned slightly to one side. These observations felt like acts of disloyalty, as if I were rewriting our history to justify the present. I hated myself for it. For 12 years, I had called him my son without hesitation. Now my thoughts questioned the bond my heart still claimed without doubt. At night, the silence became unbearable. I would lie awake replaying conversations I had never questioned before. Small moments between his mother and me resurfaced with new meaning, twisted by suspicion. I didn't want to accuse her of anything. I wasn't even sure what accusation would look like. Betrayal? A mistake? A truth buried so deep it had become invisible even to her? The possibilities were endless, and every one of them ended the same way, with damage. I tested myself constantly. I wanted to know if love could survive knowledge. When he hugged me, I paid attention to what I felt. Relief, warmth, familiarity. None of it disappeared. That scared me more than the test results ever could. If biology had failed to break the bond, then what exactly had the power to do so? Then came the guilt. A heavy, corrosive guilt that settled in my chest. I felt like I was lying to him every time I said his name. Like I was withholding something that belonged to him. This truth wasn't just mine. It was his identity, his origin, his story. And I was sitting on it, deciding its fate alone. I had become the gatekeeper of a reality that could reshape his entire sense of self. I watched him struggle with ordinary problems, friendships, school pressure, the confusion of growing up, and I wondered if I had the right to guide him through any of it. Who was I to give advice about life when I was hiding something this fundamental from him? Yet, every time I imagined telling him, my mind froze at the aftermath. The questions he would ask, the look on his face, the possibility that I would become optional. The tension finally spilled over into my relationship with his mother. She noticed the distance before I found the courage to name it. I became quieter, less present, cautious in ways I had never been before. She asked if something was wrong. I told her I was tired. It was the easiest lie I had ever told, because it contained a piece of truth. The confrontation happened without planning. One evening, when the house felt too small for the silence I was carrying, I told her we needed to talk. I placed the test results on the table between us, unable to meet her eyes. For a moment, there was only confusion on her face. Then recognition. Then fear. She didn't deny it. That was what broke me. She spoke in fragments. About uncertainty. About timing. About things she had buried because life moved forward and demanded it. She cried. I listened, detached and exhausted, realizing that this truth had lived inside our home long before it ever reached me. The difference was that I had only just begun to feel its weight. That night, I understood something that terrified me. The test hadn't destroyed my life. It had exposed a fault line that had always been there, hidden beneath years of routine and love. The ground hadn't cracked yet, but it was shifting. And the person standing directly above that fracture, completely unaware of it, was the one I loved most. After the true surface between his mother and me, nothing felt automatic anymore. Every interaction required intention. Every word had to be chosen carefully, as if the wrong one could collapse what was still standing. We spoke in hushed tones, not because he might overhear, but because saying things out loud made them more real. She asked me what I wanted to do. It was a question loaded with assumptions, that I had options, that any of them would be clean, that choosing one wouldn't permanently scar someone else. I didn't answer her right away. I couldn't. For 12 years, I had lived inside a role I never questioned. Now I was being asked whether I still wanted it once biology had withdrawn its claim. I began to notice how differently people talk about parenthood when blood is removed from the equation. Words like choice, commitment, and responsibility replaced words like natural and instinct. It felt unfair. I had already paid the cost of being a parent. Sleepless nights, sacrifices, fear, pride. You don't get refunds on those things. You only get memories. I watched him more closely than ever, not out of doubt, but out of fear. Fear that I would miss something important while being trapped inside my own thoughts. Fear that my hesitation would show. He was entering an age where awareness sharpens, where silence is read as judgment. I could not afford to become distant now, not when he needed stability more than ever. There were moments when resentment tried to surface, not toward him, but toward the situation, toward the randomness of it all, toward a system that could place a child in my arms and wait 12 years to tell me the truth. I hated that love could be put on trial by a laboratory result. I hated that something as complex as fatherhood could be reduced to a percentage on a page. I considered leaving. Not physically, but emotionally. The idea came quietly, almost politely. It suggested distance as protection, detachment as survival. But every time I entertained it, I imagined his face when I didn't show up. When I stopped being the person he expected to be there. That image was unbearable. Whatever the truth was, I had already shaped his understanding of safety. Walking away would not undo that. It would only destroy it. Eventually, the conversation we had been avoiding became unavoidable. Not with him, but about him. His mother asked when we would tell him. The word when felt heavier than if. I realized then that silence was no longer neutral. It was becoming a decision of its own, one that favored my comfort over his right to know. I rehearsed the conversation endlessly in my head. Every version ended the same way, with him looking at me differently. That was the part one couldn't prepare for. I could survive anger. I could survive questions. But the possibility of losing the quiet certainty in his eyes, the belief that I was immovable, that terrified me. One evening, as I helped him with his homework, he looked up and asked a simple question. something unrelated, something ordinary. And for reasons I still don't fully understand, it nearly broke me. Because in that moment, I realized how much of our relationship was built on trust he had never had to question. I was standing on the edge of changing that forever. That night, I made a decision, not about biology, but about presence. I could not control how this truth would reshape his world, but I could control whether I stayed in it. Love, I realized, was no longer something I could take for granted. It was something I would have to actively choose every day, even when it hurt. And I knew the final choice, the one that would define us both, was no longer far away. We told him on a quiet evening, the kind that doesn't announce its importance. There were no raised voices, no dramatic pauses, no perfect words. Just honesty, delivered carefully, imperfectly, and far later than it should have been. I remember how small the room felt, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. At first, he didn't react. He stared at the floor, processing information that had no reference point in his world. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes weren't angry. They were searching. He asked questions slowly, as if each one required permission. Did you know? When did you find out? Does this change anything? That last question lingered in the air longer than the others. I answered as truthfully as I could. I told him that biology had changed nothing about the years we shared, but that honesty mattered because he mattered. I told him that being his father was not something a test could take away from the life we had built. I don't know if my words landed the way I hoped they would. I only know that they were real. The days that followed were heavy. He became quieter, more inward. Not withdrawn, but cautious. I watched him reassess memories the same way I had, deciding which ones still belonged to him. It was painful to witness, knowing I had placed that burden on his shoulders. But I stayed present. I didn't rush him. I didn't demand reassurance. I understood that trust, once shaken, needs time to remember itself. One night, weeks later, he knocked on my door. He didn't say much. He just asked if we could sit together for a while. We did. No conversation. No explanations. Just the familiar silence we had shared since he was small. In that moment, I understood something simple and profound. Relationships don't survive because they are untested. They survive because they are tended to after the test. Life didn't return to what it was before. It couldn't. But it moved forward. Slowly. Carefully. We found a new normal, one built on transparency rather than assumption. The truth didn't erase our bond. It redefined it. And in doing so, it forced both of us to grow. I still don't know what the future holds. Biology may claim its place in his story one day in ways I cannot predict. But I know this: fatherhood is not proven in a laboratory. It is proven in presence, in consistency, in the choice to stay when staying is no longer easy. I raised a child for 12 years, and a test tried to tell me that life was a lie. But what it revealed instead was something far more difficult, and far more meaningful. Love, when stripped of certainty, becomes intentional. And I am still here,